There was a time when I believed every meaningful thing in life announced itself. I thought the moments that changed you would arrive with unmistakable weight, through loss, through triumph, through words so unforgettable that they divided your life into a before and an after. I expected transformation to be loud enough that no one could mistake it for anything else. I was wrong. The deepest changes never asked to be noticed. They entered quietly, almost politely, slipping into ordinary days, until one morning I realized I no longer experienced the world the same way I once had. There wasn't a single event I could point to. No dramatic confession, no impossible coincidence, no perfectly timed conversation that explained everything. Just a slow rearrangement of perspective, so gradual that I only recognized it after it had already become part of me. That's what unsettles me the most. Not that something changed, but that it changed without asking whether I was ready. I've always trusted structure, not because I dislike uncertainty, but because structure gives the mind somewhere stable to stand while everything else continues moving. It creates distance between impulse and action, between feeling and decision, between observation and conclusion. That distance has always been enough. It allowed me to move through people without becoming tangled inside them, to appreciate them without depending on them, to understand them without confusing understanding for closeness. It wasn't loneliness. It wasn't isolation. It was simply the way I existed, self-contained, measured, deliberate. Most people never questioned it. They accepted whatever version of me happened to meet them that day. Some believed I was quiet. Others assumed I was difficult to read. A few imagined there was some mystery hidden underneath, though they usually lost interest before discovering there was nothing theatrical waiting beneath the surface, only complexity. The kind that doesn't perform, the kind that doesn't ask to be explored. It simply exists. And that existence always felt enough until something shifted, not outside of me, inside. There's a strange feeling that appears when you encounter someone who doesn't interrupt your thoughts, but somehow continues them, not because they agree with everything you believe. Agreement is ordinary. It happens every day. What unsettled me was something entirely different. It was the experience of hearing another perspective that didn't compete with mine. It expanded it, as though an unfinished sentence had quietly found its final words. I didn't notice it immediately. If anything, I resisted the possibility. The mind is careful with unfamiliar patterns. It searches for ordinary explanations, coincidence, projection, temporary fascination. The brain prefers explanations that preserve its existing structure. Anything else requires reconstruction, and reconstruction is expensive. It asks you to question assumptions you've relied on for years. It asks you to admit that certainty isn't always as complete as it appears. So I ignored it. At least I tried to. I convinced myself that what I noticed wasn't actually there, that I was reading too much into ordinary moments, that familiarity can sometimes emerge naturally between people without meaning anything larger. That explanation satisfied me for a while, but reality has a habit of returning, not dramatically, battenly, again and again, until denial becomes more exhausting than acceptance. That's when I started paying attention, not to you, to myself. Because the most interesting part of any connection isn't the other person, it's who you become while standing in front of them. Most conversations leave me exactly as they found me. I participate, I contribute, I leave. Nothing fundamental changes. But there were moments, small ones, almost invisible, where I noticed something different. After speaking with you, my thoughts continued, not about what had been said, about what had become possible, because it had been said, ideas unfolded further than they normally would. Questions remained alive instead of reaching quick conclusions. Silence carried momentum instead of emptiness. That had never happened before, not consistently, certainly not naturally. I found myself returning to concepts I'd already examined years ago, only to realize they weren't complete after all. Not incorrect, incomplete. There's an important difference. Being wrong requires replacement, being incomplete requires expansion. Expansion is far more difficult. It demands humility. It asks you to make room for truths that don't erase what came before, but refuse to fit inside it. I wasn't accustomed to making that kind of room. I preferred precision, definitions, clean edges. The world made more sense when everything occupied its proper place. People belonged in categories. Experiences belonged in memory. Thoughts belonged in sequence. Everything organized, everything understandable. Until I encountered something that refused organization altogether. Not because it was chaotic, because it was alive. Some realities don't remain still long enough to be categorized. The moment you believe you've understood them, they've already become something slightly different. They grow, they adapt, they reveal another layer beneath the one you thought was final. And perhaps that's why they feel so difficult to describe. Language prefers finished things. It likes certainty, definitions, clear beginnings, and equally clear endings. But not everything honors those boundaries. Some experiences continue unfolding long after you've attempted to explain them. Every explanation becomes outdated almost immediately, not because it was false, because reality continued moving while words remained where you left them. That's the challenge I've been facing. How do you describe something that changes every time you examine it? How do you define something whose most honest quality is that it refuses definition? Perhaps you don't. Perhaps you simply witness it. There's a quiet discipline in witnessing. It asks nothing except honesty. No performance, no conclusions forced before they're ready. Just attention, pure attention, the kind that's becoming increasingly rare. Most people don't actually observe. They predict, they compare, they translate every new experience into something familiar before it has the chance to reveal its own nature. We mistake recognition for understanding. We assume similarity means sameness. It doesn't. Every meaningful encounter deserves to be experienced before it's interpreted. Otherwise, we spend our lives meeting memories instead of reality. I realized I'd been doing exactly that, not only with people, with myself. I'd become accustomed to believing I already knew who I was. That self-knowledge was something permanent, achieved, finished. But perhaps identity isn't something you complete. Perhaps it's something that keeps revealing itself through the people capable of reflecting parts you've never been positioned to see alone. A mirror doesn't invent your face. It simply shows you what your own eyes cannot observe directly. That thought stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because it was comforting, because it carried consequences. If another person can reveal something essential about who you are, then independence has limits I never wanted to acknowledge, not dependence. That's something entirely different. I'm speaking about perspective. No matter how deeply you understand yourself, there will always be angles hidden from your own view. Not because you're dishonest, because consciousness isn't designed to observe itself completely. It needs reflection, not validation, profession. There's wisdom in that distinction. Validation tells you you're already enough. Confrontation shows you what you couldn't see. One preserves comfort. The other creates growth. Growth rarely feels comfortable. It rearranges familiar landscapes. It asks questions your previous identity cannot answer. And somewhere along the way, I realized I had stopped asking those questions. Not because I believed I knew everything, because I'd become efficient. Efficiency is useful until it begins replacing curiosity. That's when life quietly starts repeating itself. Different days, different faces, the same conclusions, the same patterns, the same carefully maintained understanding of everything. Predictable, reliable, smaller than it appears. Perhaps that's why this feels significant, not because certainty disappeared, because curiosity returned. Real curiosity, the kind that doesn't seek immediate answers. The kind willing to remain uncertain long enough for better questions to emerge. I'd forgotten what that felt like, to stand inside uncertainty without rushing toward resolution, to allow complexity to remain complex, to admit that some truths deserve patience more than explanation. It's remarkable how quickly the mind tries to close open spaces. Silence makes us nervous. Ambiguity makes us impatient. We fill gaps almost instinctively with assumptions, with narratives, with conclusions assembled from incomplete evidence. Anything feels better than not knowing, or so we tell ourselves. I've started wondering whether not knowing is actually where understanding begins, because certainty often ends observation. Once you've decided what something is, you stop paying attention. Why would you continue looking? You've already concluded the search. But what if the conclusion arrived too early? What if certainty isn't proof of understanding, but evidence that curiosity has stopped? That possibility has followed me everywhere lately, not as doubt, as invitation. An invitation to experience reality before explaining it, to listen without preparing responses, to notice without immediately naming, to remain present long enough for meaning to reveal itself instead of forcing it into familiar shapes. It's harder than I imagined. The mind loves efficiency. It loves shortcuts, patterns, predictions, but sometimes those strengths become limitations. Sometimes the fastest understanding is also the shallowest one. Diefte asks for time, attention, stillness. Things our world rarely rewards. And yet those are precisely the conditions where the most meaningful truths seem to emerge. Not while chasing, not while forcing, simply while remaining available to what already exists. Maybe that's what I've been learning all along, not how to understand someone else, how to become someone capable of deeper understanding in the first place. Because perhaps the quality of our relationships is determined less by who enters our lives, I know more by the depth of awareness we bring when they do. I don't know where this realization ultimately leads. I don't know whether every unanswered question deserves an answer, or whether some are meant to remain open. Not because they're incomplete, but because they're alive. All I know is that something inside me has become impossible to ignore. Not a feeling, not an attachment, not even certainty, something quieter than all of those. A recognition that the person I believed myself to be is no longer standing exactly where I left him. He's moved, not far, just enough that the old maps no longer describe the landscape with complete accuracy. And perhaps that's what growth has always looked like. Not becoming someone else, becoming someone more honest than the version who thought he was already finished. I used to I used to think the strongest foundations were the ones that never moved. Stone doesn't apologize for remaining stone. Mountains don't question whether they should become rivers. There was something reassuring about that kind of permanence. Something I admired, something I tried to imitate. I built routines that protected clarity, habits that kept distraction at a distance, thoughts arranged carefully enough that nothing unexpected could remain for very long. If something didn't fit, I examined it. If it still didn't fit, I removed it, not out of fear. Out of precision, life felt cleaner that way, more understandable. The mind functions well when everything occupies a place that makes sense. Or at least, that's what I believed. Then I began noticing a strange contradiction. The strongest things in nature aren't actually rigid, they're adaptable. A tree survives storms not because it refuses to bend, but because it knows exactly how far it can. Water outlasts stone because it doesn't insist on remaining one shape forever. Even light changes depending on what it touches. Nothing truly alive remains fixed. Only things that have stopped growing demand permanence. That realization unsettled me more than I expected, because I'd spent years mistaking consistency for completeness. I'd convinced myself that stability meant I'd finally understood who I was. But understanding isn't something you finish. It's something that keeps asking better questions. The version of me that believed he had reached the end was simply standing at a place where curiosity had become quiet, not gone, yet waiting. I've started paying attention to the moments between certainty now. Those brief pauses before the mind reaches its conclusion, before experience becomes explanation, before observation becomes judgment, there's an incredible amount of truth hiding inside those pauses. Truth that usually disappears because we're too eager to move beyond them. We live in a world obsessed with immediate meaning. Every silence must contain an answer. Every connection must become a definition. Every emotion must belong to a category. People seem uncomfortable allowing anything to exist without naming it first, as though language creates reality instead of merely pointing toward it. But some things lose something essential the moment they're explained too quickly, like trying to catch sunlight in your hands. You don't keep the light, you only prove it was there. I've wondered if that's why certain moments remain unforgettable. Not because they were extraordinary, because we experienced them before trying to interpret them. Children understand this instinctively. They don't spend their first years analyzing wonder. They simply live inside it. A butterfly isn't symbolic. Rain isn't philosophical. The sky doesn't represent possibility. It simply exists, complete without explanation. Somewhere along the way, we lose that ability. We begin translating everything into concepts. We stop experiencing life directly and start experiencing our ideas about life instead. Perhaps maturity isn't gaining certainty. Perhaps it's recovering the ability to notice again. Really notice, not with the eyes, with attention. There's a difference. Looking happens automatically. Attention is a choice. And whatever receives your deepest attention slowly begins shaping the architecture of your inner world. That's both beautiful and dangerous because attention isn't passive. It builds. Quickly, petly. Every thought you return to lays another stone. Every belief you repeat strengthens another wall. Every perspective you protect eventually becomes the room you spend your life living inside. Most people never realize they're the architects of the spaces they inhabit. mentally. They believe life simply happened to them, that their perception arrived fully formed. It didn't. It was constructed, one unnoticed thought at a time, one repeated assumption at a time, one unquestioned certainty at a time. I think that's why genuine encounters matter so much. Not because another person completes you. That idea has always felt incomplete to me. No one completes another human being. Completion suggests something was missing. I don't believe that's true. What another person can do, rarely, unexpectedly, is reveal rooms inside you that you've never opened. Rooms that already existed, locked, silent, pardon, waiting for the right question instead of the right answer. There's an important difference, and what's end movement. Questions create it. I've become increasingly suspicious of people who possess immediate certainty about everything. Not because confidence is wrong, because reality has a way of humbling anyone who believes they've reached the final explanation. Every truth I've kept has changed shape over time, not disappeared, deepened. The older I become internally, the more I respect ideas that survive revision, ideas capable of growing without breaking. Perspective should breathe, otherwise it becomes ideology. And ideologies rarely listen, they defend. I've defended enough versions of myself to recognize the cost. Every identity requires maintenance. Once you decide who you are, you begin protecting that decision. You reject experiences that contradict it. You ignore evidence that complicates it, not intentionally, automatically. The ego isn't always arrogance. Sometimes it's simply yesterday refusing to make room for today. That thought stayed with me longer than I expected. How many opportunities had I overlooked simply because they didn't agree with the person I believed myself to be? How many conversations had I finished before they truly began because I'd already decided what the other person represented? How many moments had passed unnoticed because they arrived wearing unfamiliar clothes? Awareness can be uncomfortable, not because it reveals darkness, because it reveals limitation. And limitation is difficult to accept when you've spent years believing your perspective was broad enough already. I've learned something surprising recently. Depth isn't measured by complexity. Some of the deepest people I've encountered speak with remarkable simplicity, not because they lack nuance, because they've traveled far enough through complexity to no longer need it. A river doesn't announce how many mountains it crossed. It simply continues flowing. There's wisdom in quiet confidence, not the confidence that demands recognition, the confidence that no longer depends on it. I've spent much of my life believing understanding required explanation. Now, I'm beginning to wonder if understanding often appears as restraint instead, knowing exactly when words would reduce something instead of revealing it. Not every silence is emptiness. Some silences are full beyond language, like standing beneath a night sky. No description improves the stars. Some experiences ask only to be witnessed. I've started trusting those moments more, not because they provide certainty, because they provide presence. Presence has become increasingly valuable to me, not physical presence. Eternal presence, the ability to remain completely inside a moment without mentally escaping toward the next one. It's astonishing how rarely we actually arrive where we already are. The body reaches places long before the mind does. We eat while thinking about tomorrow. We listen while preparing responses. We walk through beautiful afternoons, carrying conversations that ended years ago. The present becomes invisible because memory and anticipation keep negotiating over it. I've done that too, more than I realized, always preparing, always evaluating, always turning experience into information before allowing it to become experience first. Efficiency again, useful, until it begins replacing life itself. There's a softness I've started respecting, not weakness, softness. The kind that remains open without becoming fragile, the kind that listens without surrendering discernment, the kind that welcomes complexity instead of fearing it. For years, I confused softness with vulnerability. I thought openness meant losing yourself. Now I see something different. The strongest people I've ever known weren't protected by walls, they were protected by clarity. A wall keeps everyone out. Clarity lets the right things remain while allowing everything else to pass through without leaving unnecessary weight behind. That's a different kind of strength. One I never understood before. Maybe because walls are easier. You build them once. Clarity requires constant attention. It asks you to keep learning, to keep refining, to keep questioning your own conclusions before questioning anyone else's. That's difficult work, hets. Invisible work. No one applauds it. No one notices when a person quietly becomes wiser. They only notice the moments wisdom finally becomes visible. But the visible moment is never where transformation begins. It begins alone, in ordinary afternoons, in private reflections, in the decision to tell yourself the truth one more time than you're tempted to avoid it. Truth has an unusual quality. It rarely shouts, it waits, sport enough to remain exactly where you left it until you're finally prepared to return. I've left many truths waiting, not because I wanted to escape them, because timing matters. Some understandings arrive too early and become burdens. The same understanding arriving later becomes freedom. Maybe wisdom isn't collecting answers. Maybe it's becoming the kind of person capable of carrying them without breaking beneath their weight. I've stopped chasing certainty lately. Not because certainty has no value, because I finally realized peace doesn't come from knowing everything. It comes from no longer needing to. There is freedom in admitting the horizon will always remain beyond reach. Not disappointing freedom, beautiful freedom, because it means reality will always remain larger than my understanding of it. There will always be another layer, another perspective, another quiet truth waiting just beyond the edge of what I currently believe, and strangely, find comfort in that now. Not because the unknown became smaller, because I stopped demanding that it become known before I allowed myself to appreciate its existence. Perhaps that's the quiet transformation I never expected. Not learning how to control uncertainty, learning how to walk beside it without asking it to become something else. And maybe that's where real clarity begins. Not at the end of every question, but at the moment you stop being afraid of living without every answer.